Hello, welcome back to The Breakdown, week 56, episode 56 in a collector's series. This week, there was some very big news starting Sunday night. Of course, the president announcing that United States Special Operations Forces had killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. And we got a whole bunch of questions from people related to those events. Andrew Hackard, who is one of our regular listeners, loyal listener, and I think we've asked one of his questions on the show before, basically said, can you do a special breakdown that talks about what this means for the war on terror? And I think it's a great idea, and I just so happen to have the perfect guest, my friend and colleague Jeremy Scahill. He's a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute, author of the best-selling Blackwater, Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. He's been on Democracy Now! He writes for us. He's got a great piece up right now about JSOC, and he's working on a book around some related issues. Jeremy, welcome to The Breakdown.
Good to be with you, Chris.
Okay, I think maybe let's start with the actual unit that carried out this mission, and we'll divide this into two parts. First part is, what does what happened in Abbottabad, Pakistan, reveal about the war on terror as it's currently being waged by Barack Obama?
I mean, first of all, what it shows is that President Obama has really doubled down on this Bush administration policy of targeted killing. That is, that the United States reserves the right to go into any country, including an allied country, with or without permission of that government, to kill people that the president has determined to pose a national security threat to the United States. And what it also does is it busts the meme that a lot of right-wingers and Republicans have been pushing, that President Obama is somehow soft on terrorism or is some kind of a dove. So what we see is that this policy of targeted killing is going to be at the forefront of U.S. counterterrorism policy under Democrats and Republicans alike. The stakes are very high, though, because of the fact that the United States seems to have gone into Pakistan without the Pakistani government's permission or knowledge. And so you have what appears to be this crisis right now between the Pakistanis and the United States. But the reality is, Chris, that going back at least 5 years, the Pakistani government has tacitly allowed U.S. Special Operations Forces to hit in Pakistan as long as the Pakistanis have been able to deny it and condemn it. This is not the first time this has happened. It's just the highest profile case that we have.
So what you're telling me is that this kind of operation in which we have some small group of highly trained American members of the military go into a country and target someone identified as a terrorist, that this has happened before. This is not new.
Right. In fact, a few days after Osama bin Laden was killed, the Thursday after Osama bin Laden was killed, U.S. forces struck in Yemen and did a targeted strike against 2 suspected members of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And that was the 4th or 5th incident in Yemen under President Barack Obama, where U.S. Special Operations Forces or the CIA have struck. In 2009, President Obama authorized a hit against a Shabab commander inside of Somalia. In the case of Pakistan, this has been going on for a very long time. One of the things that the WikiLeaks cables revealed was that as of last December, the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad was acknowledging that U.S. Special Operations Forces were acting unilaterally at times inside of Pakistan and other times acting in concert with certain special units of the Pakistani military or the Frontier Corps, which is a federal paramilitary force, to actually go after and target and kill militants. So President Obama has actually been very aggressive in authorizing these targeted strikes. And in September of 2009, General David Petraeus, who at the time was the commander of CENTCOM, issued what's called an execute order that authorized U.S. Special Operations Forces to strike off of the stated battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. And that was an update of an order that Bush had issued in 03-04. So Obama really has not only continued it, but has sort of expanded the battlefield and is hitting much harder in places like Yemen and Somalia than Bush ever did.
So the sort of operational part of this, my understanding, is part of the military that's called the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC for short. You've written a lot about JSOC. You've been doing a ton of reporting on them for quite some time now. Tell us a little bit about what JSOC is and how it changed or expanded over the first few years of this administration.
Right. I mean, well, the Joint Special Operations Commander, JSOC, really grew out of the failed mission in 1980 to rescue the Americans during the siege of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran. And that was a catastrophic failure. That mission was a failure. And so the Special Operations community came together and said, we need to build up an elite unit that can respond to terrorist threats, hostage situations, international crises, and ensure that they're not going to fail. And so they started to build up this really elite force that would draw from all of the branches of of the military and take the best of the best and create an effective all-star team of special operations forces. And so you had the rise of JSOC really start in the 1980s. In the 90s under Clinton, they had a sort of twofold mission. On the one hand, they would carry out very discreet counterterrorism operations, in some cases targeted killing, although they were very limited under President Clinton on the one hand. And then on the other hand, they were to respond on U.S. soil to weapons of mass destruction threats or provide discrete security, counterterrorism security at things like the Olympics in 1996 when they were in Atlanta or inaugurations. And JSOC is the only unit of the military that is permanently exempted from posse comitatus, the U.S. law that prohibits the U.S. military from engaging in operations on U.S. soil. When 9/11 happened, Chris, the Bush administration put JSOC front and center at the U.S. strategy to hunt down and kill anyone that the White House designated as a terrorist. And what happened, and this comes from the reporting that I've been doing over the years, what happened is that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and Vice President Cheney essentially took JSOC out of the conventional chain of command and began just directing them to do targeted killing operations that would be shielded from congressional oversight. In other words, they had them jump into the arena that was the sovereign realm of the Central Intelligence Agency and had to be briefed to Congress. By using JSOC and a military operation, they were effectively able to use this hit squad without any oversight. And that was the time when General Stanley McChrystal was running the Joint Special Operations Command. After Rumsfeld left as defense secretary, Robert Gates started to kind of clean up the ship and said, we need to bring JSOC back under the basic command of the U.S. military. What you've seen under President Obama is an attempt to put the CIA and JSOC back on the same team. This war that Rumsfeld was waging against the State Department and the CIA in favor of the JSOC types was unacceptable to President Obama and to Secretary of Defense Gates. And so when you see the kinds of hits that take place, like the one we saw against Osama bin Laden, it's largely a result of mending the fence or the differences between JSOC and the CIA and putting all hands back on deck. And I talked recently to a member of the House Intelligence Committee who told me that that really was a tremendous accomplishment to end this kind of siphoning off of resources by two very important entities within the U.S. national security apparatus. President Obama uses these guys widely. And my understanding from talking to people in that community is that they have a tremendous amount of respect for him. I will say, though, that while everyone is celebrating the successful hit against Osama bin Laden, this force has also been responsible for some of the worst massacres of civilians that we've seen in Afghanistan, namely the killing of pregnant women in Gardez, Afghanistan in February 2010. And I went and interviewed the survivors of that raid. They tried to cover it up when they first killed these women and blame it on a Taliban honor killing. And it turns out that it was JSOC that was fed bad intel, and they went in and they killed all these people and tried to cover it up. JSOC also killed Linda Norgrove, the British aid worker, during a botched rescue attempt. So, there's two sides to this coin at least. There's the successful ops against bin Laden and probably countless other people who we can't name. And then there are the times when it goes wrong and they end up killing civilians and potentially open the door for blowback.
You talked about the sort of celebration that's going on, and I don't mean that in the country and the people outside the White House. I mean in terms of the degree to which the administration is, I think congratulating itself on successfully carrying out this mission, okaying, etc. Let's turn now sort of projecting forward. What do you see the effect of this being in terms of this endorsing or expanding what has already been the trend, which is to sort of shift the war on terror away from large occupying armies and these sort of more targeted operations? Is that what we can kind of expect? And what do you make of that, whether that's a good or bad development?
Well, I mean, it's already on. And in fact, this is very similar to what Vice President Joe Biden was advocating when they did the initial Afghanistan review when President Obama took office. Biden wanted to have a real focus on targeted killing operations and try to draw down the more massive conventional force presence in Afghanistan. And this is really the future. In fact, almost everyone I've talked to that works within the special operations community is sort of chopping at the bits and saying, who's next? Talked to a guy today who's a veteran of U.S. intelligence and military intelligence operations. And he was saying, we should go and kill Adam Gaddan, this so-called, American al-Qaeda guy. He was saying, we can go after him next. Or Anwar al-Awlaki, who's another American citizen that is hiding in Yemen and putting up videos on YouTube calling for, jihad against the United States. So you have two things unfolding, Chris. On the one hand, the question of what are we going to do about Afghanistan? Are we going to build up more conventional forces there? And then on the other hand, the shadow war, which has been raging through the Bush and Obama administrations. Whether or not it's right, well, I mean, that in some ways boils down to a moral question of what you believe about, or a legal question, what you believe about targeted assassination. You know, the U.S. generally has a ban on assassinations. The way that the Obama administration has gotten around it in the case of bin Laden is by saying it was a military operation against a commander of forces that are threatening the national security of the United States. You could look at it from the Pakistani perspective or the perspective of people in Yemen or Somalia or elsewhere that say the U.S. has no business coming into sovereign territory unannounced and killing people. It is a targeted assassination, but the U.S. has asserted the right to do that. So I think that it's a very dangerous road to go down to believe that you can kill your way to peace, that you can somehow kill every quote-unquote bad guy. And I loved what you wrote in this current issue of The Nation magazine about that very issue. You know, we characterize people as bad guys worthy of death, and then we go and kill them. Well, we need to step back sometimes and say, when we kill that one individual that we've determined to be a threat, are we not in the process creating scores of others that are going to rise up against us, particularly when civilians are killed? So I think we need to take a really sober look at the possibility for blowback before we co-sign this idea that we're going to be able to kill all the quote-unquote bad guys until there are no more. You can't kill terrorism. You need to take away the motivation for people to get involved with acts of terrorism.
Jeremy Scahill is a Puffin Foundation writing fellow at the Nation Institute, a regular contributor to our magazine. He has a piece in this week's issue of The Nation, which we'll link to on the website. And you should absolutely, if you have not yet, check out his book about Blackwater, the Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. Jeremy, a great pleasure. Thanks a lot, man.
Thank you, Chris.